I am Claire, 33 years old, and until recently I believed my biggest problem was a husband who took me for granted. That illusion shattered the night he slid divorce papers across the table at an exclusive French restaurant, looked me dead in the eyes and told me to sign them because I was a worthless freelancer who did not belong in his world. He smiled while his mother called me a parasite, completely unaware that a judge would soon be reading my true net worth out loud to a stunned courtroom. Before I dive into exactly how that happened, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been thrown to the curb by the person you trusted most. You will definitely want to see the look on his face when the truth came out. The nightmare unfolded at a Connecticut restaurant where reservations took months to secure. It was supposed to be our 7th anniversary dinner. I had dressed carefully, hoping the evening would be a chance for Jason and me to reconnect. Jason is 35 and works as a mid-level finance director. Recently, he had grown obsessed with status, constantly chasing the approval of his wealthy colleagues. That obsession slowly ate away at our marriage, replacing affection with complaints about my lack of corporate ambition. When I arrived, the hostess led me to a private dining room. I expected a romantic table for two. Instead, I opened the heavy doors to find a firing squad waiting. Jason sat at the head of the table swirling a glass of red wine. He did not even look up. Sitting to his right was his mother, Patricia. At 62 years old, Patricia treated condescension like an Olympic sport. She wore a diamond bracelet that Jason had purchased using my bonus. Sitting next to her was Jason's younger sister, Stephanie. Stephanie was 31, the golden child who spent her days calling herself a lifestyle influencer, while her husband Jamal worked 70-hour weeks to fund her shopping habits. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the thick stack of legal documents resting next to Jason's plate. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I walked to the only empty chair at the table and sat down. "Honestly, Claire, it is about time we did this," Patricia announced, looking at me with unvarnished disgust. "You have been dragging him down. Jason is a finance director now. He needs a wife who can navigate charity galas, not someone who sits in her pajamas coding meaningless spreadsheets all day." "It is true," Stephanie chimed in, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "You do not even try to fit in with our crowd. Jason needs someone on his level. Someone who actually contributes to the family image instead of embarrassing him." For 7 years, I played the role of the supportive wife. When Jason wanted to live in a prestigious zip code, I emptied my premarital savings to put down the deposit on our house. He insisted the mortgage be solely in his name for tax purposes, and I trusted him. When Patricia needed help organizing her country club luncheons, I built the databases and managed logistics for free, enduring her jabs about my working-class background. I was a freelance data analyst. To them, that meant I was unemployed and living off their son. I looked at Jason. "You brought your mother and sister to our anniversary dinner to hand me divorce papers," I asked, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. "I brought my family." Jason corrected his tone, icing over. "Because they have supported me through the absolute misery of this marriage. They see what I see. You bring nothing to the table, Claire. You have no ambition. You have no drive. I am carrying the entire financial weight of this household, and I am done dragging dead weight." Before I could point out that my freelance gig paid the property taxes and covered his car lease, the doors opened again. A young woman walked in. She was 26 years old, wearing a tight green dress that highlighted the unmistakable swell of her stomach. It was Brittany. She was Jason's newest intern at the firm, the one he claimed was just a mentee needing guidance. Jason stood up instantly. He pulled out the chair next to him and guided her into the seat with a tenderness I had not seen in half a decade. Brittany looked across the table at me, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. "I am sorry, Claire," Brittany said, not sounding sorry at all. "We did not want to hurt you. But Jason and I have a real connection, and we have to think about the baby now." Patricia reached across the table and patted Brittany's hand affectionately. "We are just so thrilled." Patricia beamed, her eyes sparkling with malicious joy. "A real heir. Someone to finally carry on the family legacy properly." I looked at the four of them sitting there. The sheer audacity of the ambush was breathtaking. They had not just planned to divorce me, they had planned to humiliate me, to break me down completely, so I would sign those papers and walk away with nothing. Jason banked on the fact that I despised conflict. He expected tears. He expected me to beg. He expected me to flee the restaurant in a state of hysterical despair. Instead, I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. "I see now," I said simply. Jason frowned clearly, unsettled by my lack of hysterics. "That is it. You just say 'I see now.' What else is there to say, Jason?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "You have made your position perfectly clear to everyone sitting here. You want a divorce. You brought your pregnant affair partner to our anniversary dinner. You brought your mother and sister to act as your audience. Do not try to play the victim," Stephanie snapped from across the table. She adjusted her designer top and crossed her arms defensively. "You are lucky he tolerated your lack of ambition for this long." Jason signaled the waiter with a sharp snap of his fingers. The young server, who had been trying his best to blend into the restaurant wallpaper, hurried over holding a black leather checkbook. Jason did not even look at the total. He slid the folder directly across the linen tablecloth until it hit the edge of my plate. "Since I will be supporting a real family soon," Jason said, his voice dripping with malice, "you can cover the bill. Consider it your final financial contribution to this marriage." I looked at the leather folder. Then I looked at Jason. The absolute certainty in his eyes that he had won was the only motivation I needed. I opened the folder. The total at the bottom of the receipt read $2,145.80. They had ordered vintage champagne caviar, imported Wagyu steaks, and expensive desserts that Jason had pre-ordered to celebrate his freedom. The sheer gluttony of it was almost impressive. He genuinely believed that my freelance income would be entirely wiped out by this single meal. He expected me to put it on a credit card that he would later use to prove my financial irresponsibility in court. I did not blink. I reached into my purse and retrieved a sleek black metal corporate card that Jason had never seen before. I placed it quietly onto the restaurant receipt. I slowly closed the folder and handed it back to the terrified waiter. "Keep the change," I told the young server, adding a generous tip line before he could scurry away. Jason sharply narrowed his eyes as he caught a glimpse of the heavy metal card. "Wait, what was that? Did you open a new line of credit behind my back?" "Just taking care of the final contribution as you requested," I replied, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my dress. I picked up the divorce papers and slid them neatly into my briefcase. "I will have my attorney review these documents tomorrow morning." "You do not need an attorney," Jason scoffed, regaining his arrogant posture. "The terms are more than generous. I am letting you take your personal belongings. I am not even asking you to reimburse me for the years I spent funding your lifestyle." Patricia rolled her eyes and crossed her arms tightly. "If she hires a lawyer, she will just end up drowning in debt. Tell her, Jason. Tell her she needs to sign the agreement tonight." "I will have my attorney review it," I repeated, my voice completely stripped of the warmth I had offered this family for nearly a decade. I turned to look at Brittany. She was currently tracing the rim of her water glass, looking exceptionally pleased with herself. "Congratulations on the pregnancy, Brittany. I genuinely hope he treats you better than he treated his vows." I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room. The heavy doors shut firmly behind me, cutting off an indignant gasp from Patricia. The air outside the restaurant was thick with the threat of an impending summer storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I walked toward the parking lot. Once my car doors were locked, and I was enclosed in the silent sanctuary of my vehicle, I did not break down. I did not shed a single tear. The reaction they had so desperately wanted to see simply was not there. Instead, an icy focus settled over me. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened my banking application. It was a reflex whenever Jason pulled a stunt regarding our finances. We maintained a joint checking and savings account, where we pooled our resources for household expenses and emergencies. I meticulously deposited my share of the bills into that account on the first of every month. I tapped the screen and the biometric scan unlocked the financial dashboard. The balance in our joint savings account, which yesterday had held $84,500, now read $12.45. My breath hitched in my throat. I quickly opened the transaction history tab. Earlier that afternoon at exactly 2:15, there was a single massive wire transfer. $84,487.55 had been moved to a private account registered solely under Jason's name. He had drained it completely. Every single penny of our emergency fund, the money I had contributed for a new roof for potential medical emergencies for the life we were supposed to be building together, was gone. He wiped it out hours before handing me the divorce papers, ensuring I would have absolutely nothing to fall back on when he kicked me out of our home. A cold smile touched my lips as his plan sank in. He really thought he had orchestrated the perfect murder of our marriage. He thought I was a helpless and financially dependent housewife who would be crushed under the weight of his calculated cruelty. He assumed the sudden lack of funds would force me into immediate submission. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the restaurant parking lot. The storm broke halfway through my drive, sending heavy rain lashing against the windshield in violent sheets, the rhythmic sound of the wipers matching the rapid calculations forming in my mind. Jason thought he had cornered a helpless mouse. He expected me to panic, to call him crying and desperately begging for access to my stolen money. He was so incredibly, completely, and utterly wrong. By the time I pulled into the driveway of our Connecticut home, the neighborhood was dark save for the ambient glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. The rain had intensified, pounding against the roof of my car, like a physical manifestation of the chaos Jason had tried to unleash on my life. I dashed through the heavy downpour, reaching the covered front porch. I pulled out my key ring and slid my key into the heavy brass lock. It would not turn. I pulled the key out, wiped the rainwater from my eyelashes, and tried again. It slid in perfectly, but the internal mechanism was completely rigid. I leaned in closer, squinting through the darkness and the driving rain. The entire lock cylinder was brand new. It was a gleaming, unblemished brass fixture that definitely had not been there when I left for the restaurant just 3 hours ago. I pressed the code into the keypad for the garage door. The panel remained dark, completely disabled. He had thought of everything, but looking through the small, rain-streaked window of the side door, I saw exactly what he had done with my life. Dozens of heavy-duty black trash bags were stacked haphazardly in the center of the concrete floor. Through the semi-transparent plastic of one bag, I could clearly see the bright red fabric of my favorite winter coat. Next to it sat a large cardboard box hastily taped shut with the words "Claire's Junk" scrawled across the side in thick black marker. I did none of those things. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed the local police precinct. "Hello. I need an officer dispatched to my residence," I said, keeping my voice steady and authoritative, cutting clearly through the loud rumble of the thunder overhead. "My husband has illegally locked me out of our primary residence without a court order or any formal eviction notice. Yes, my identification matches the address perfectly." While I waited for the police cruiser to arrive, I stood under the meager shelter of the garage overhang. My mind was not focused on the trash bags or the drained savings account or the sickening smirk on Patricia's face. My mind was calculating timelines and legal liabilities. Jason thought he had cornered a helpless mouse. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked into the cage of a lion. The police cruiser pulled up 20 minutes later, its bright headlights piercing through the heavy rain. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their expressions guarded but highly professional. I explained the situation calmly and concisely, presenting my state-issued driver's license, which clearly proved this was my legal residence. I did not mention the pregnant mistress or the restaurant ambush or the stolen $84,000. I simply stated the undeniable facts. I went to dinner, returned home, and found the locks changed without any prior legal warning or documentation. "Ma'am, because your name is not currently listed on the deed. This can get slightly complicated," the older officer explained, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "But he cannot legally execute a self-help eviction like this. You have clearly established tenancy here, and locking you out is a direct violation of state law. It took them exactly 10 minutes of banging heavily on the front door, which Jason obviously was not behind, likely still celebrating his grand victory downtown, before they authorized an emergency locksmith to grant me entry. By the time I finally stepped into the dry, quiet foyer of the house, it was nearly midnight. The officers conducted a quick sweep of the premises, confirmed the house was completely empty, and strongly advised me to contact a family lawyer first thing in the morning before leaving me to the silence. I did not turn on the main lights. I walked quietly through the darkness of the living room, gliding past the expensive Italian leather sofa Jason had insisted we buy to impress his corporate colleagues. I headed straight down the hall to my home office. My dual monitors were exactly where I had left them. Jason had not bothered to pack up my workspace, likely assuming that my computer equipment was practically worthless. To him, my work was just coding meaningless spreadsheets. He did not understand technology, and he certainly did not understand data architecture. He was a finance guy who looked exclusively at balance sheets and profit margins. If a project did not involve an immediate corporate bonus, he deemed it entirely irrelevant. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, booted up my primary workstation, and connected securely to my private virtual network. The quiet hum of the processor felt incredibly grounding. As the high-resolution screens flickered to life, my email client pinged with an urgent notification. It was not a gloating message from Jason. It was an automated alert from the bank regarding the property. Because my name was still listed as a secondary contact on the homeowner's insurance policy, the bank's automated monitoring system had flagged a massive change in the property's financial status. I opened the email with a steady hand. My eyes scanned the formal text, and my breath caught sharply in my throat as a new layer of his betrayal revealed itself. Notice of full absolute approval for a home equity line of credit. I quickly logged straight into the secure mortgage portal, using the administrative credentials I managed for our household bills. The secure screen loaded, and the reality of Jason's master plan laid itself out in stark, undeniable numbers. Jason had not just drained our emergency savings. 2 weeks ago, he had finalized a massive loan against the equity of the house, the exact same house that I had put the $150,000 down payment on 7 years ago. Because the real estate market had boomed, the property had nearly doubled in value. Jason had quietly leveraged that accumulated equity, pulling out a staggering $200,000 in cash behind my back. The sheer scale of his financial abuse was escalating by the minute. I grabbed my notepad and began documenting every single fraudulent number, preparing for the absolute devastating war ahead, and making absolutely positively certain that he would lose everything tonight. I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I dove deeper into the transaction history. I needed to trace exactly where that $200,000 of stolen equity had been dispersed. The absolute arrogance of the man left a painfully clear paper trail, practically begging a forensic accountant to tear it apart. I opened the transfer logs and began matching the routing numbers to the corresponding payee accounts. The first major transfer was for $45,000. It had been wired directly to a checking account belonging to his sister, Stephanie. The memo line attached to the transfer boldly read, "Debt consolidation and gift." I stared at the screen, a harsh laugh escaping my lips. Jason had taken the equity straight out of my home to pay off his sister's staggering credit card debt. The exact same sister who had just sat at the restaurant table telling me I contributed absolutely nothing to the family. She was funding her fake luxury influencer lifestyle using the walls that literally sheltered me. The second transfer made my blood run entirely cold. $65,000 had been wired to a high-end luxury car dealership located in downtown Hartford. A quick cross-reference with the dealership's recent inventory confirmed exactly what I already suspected. Brittany had not purchased that brand-new white Range Rover she had been aggressively flaunting on her social media pages all week. Jason had bought it for her. He had leveraged my down payment to finance his pregnant mistress's comfort, ensuring she could drive around in luxury while he plotted to leave me homeless in the rain. The remaining $90,000 was sitting in the exact same private account where he had moved our joint emergency savings. The entire strategy was sickeningly clear. He was deliberately and systematically draining the marital estate. By taking out massive debts solely in his name and giving the cash away to his family and his mistress, he was preparing to walk into divorce court claiming he was completely broke. He intended to present himself as a financially ruined man, drowning in liabilities. Because Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, he was going to demand that I take on 50% of the marital debt. He actually wanted me to pay for his sister's designer handbags and his mistress's luxury SUV. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the harsh blue glow of the monitors casting long shadows against the walls of my office. The sheer scale of his financial abuse was staggering to witness. It was not just a betrayal of our marriage vows. It was a highly coordinated, systematic destruction of my financial future, fully supported and celebrated by Patricia and Stephanie. They had cheered him on while he robbed me blind. I felt no urge to cry. The time for tears had passed hours ago in that private dining room. Now there was only cold, calculated retaliation. I inserted an encrypted flash drive into my computer and began downloading every single document. I generated PDF copies of the home equity line of credit approval, the wire transfer confirmations, the joint account depletion, and the corresponding timestamps. I took high-resolution screenshots of everything, ensuring there was an undeniable digital paper trail that even the most expensive defense lawyer could never dispute. Jason thought he could outsmart me because he held a fancy title at a financial firm. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was a senior data analyst. My entire career was built on finding anomalies, tracking discrepancies, and uncovering hidden truths within massive data sets. Tracking his sloppy, arrogant money transfers was like shooting fish in a barrel. Once the files were securely encrypted and backed up to a secondary cloud server, I safely ejected the flash drive and slipped it into my inner pocket. I stood up and looked around the home office. This room had been my sanctuary for 5 years. It was where I had spent countless sleepless nights building a future I thought we would share. Now it was just a crime scene. The police officers had told me I had every legal right to stay in the house. Jason could not force me out without a formal eviction notice. But staying here sleeping in the guest room while waiting for him to return and parade his victory in my face played right into his hands. He wanted me to feel trapped. He wanted a messy, emotional confrontation. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I needed to disappear completely, cutting off his supply of drama and control. I walked to the storage closet and pulled out 2 heavy-duty protective cases designed for transporting sensitive electronics. I did not care about the clothes he had thrown into the garbage bags in the damp garage. Those were just fabric and threads. I cared about my servers. I carefully dismantled my primary workstation, packing the hard drives, the backup arrays, and the proprietary hardware I used for my work. I packed them with meticulous care, ensuring my life's work was entirely secure. I loaded the heavy cases onto a dolly and rolled them out the front door, pushing them through the driving rain and hoisting them into the trunk of my car. I made one final sweep of the house, grabbing my passport, my birth certificate, and a small bag of essential toiletries. I left the expensive Italian leather sofa. I left the crystal dining set Patricia had forced us to buy. I left the framed wedding photos hanging on the hallway walls. I stood in the foyer one last time, listening to the heavy rain drumming against the roof. Tomorrow, Jason would come back here expecting to find a broken, weeping woman begging for her life back. Instead, he would find an empty office and a profound, terrifying silence. I locked the front door behind me, knowing I would never step foot inside this property again. I got into my car, the heater slowly warming my damp clothes as the storm raged on outside. I pulled out my phone and navigated to a heavily encrypted web portal that Jason did not even know existed. I entered my complex 2-factor authentication code past the secondary biometric security prompt and logged directly into the corporate dashboard. I needed to verify my hidden assets before making my next move. It was time to look at the ultimate weapon that was going to burn his entire world to the absolute ground. The screen illuminated the dark interior of my car, casting a crisp white light across my face. I stared at the holding account balance displayed on the corporate dashboard of Lumina Data Solutions, LLC. The numbers stared back at me in stark, undeniable perfection. $45,250,000 and 0 cents. For the past 5 years, while Jason thought I was doing low-level freelance work in my pajamas, I had been building a predictive analytics software platform designed exclusively for global supply chain logistics. I quietly registered the limited liability company in Delaware to ensure corporate anonymity. I worked 80-hour weeks utilizing dummy data sets and running endless beta tests until the proprietary algorithm was flawless. Jason never bothered to ask about my work. When I told him I was busy, he mocked me for playing startup. When I spent weekends coding complex data structures, he aggressively complained that I was not adequately preparing for his mother's pretentious Sunday brunches. He never knew that Lumina Data Solutions caught the attention of a major tech conglomerate out in Silicon Valley. He never knew about the intense negotiations, the grueling due diligence audits, or the massive bidding war that erupted over my proprietary software. And he certainly did not know that exactly 3 months ago the acquisition had been finalized and the funds had been fully dispersed. I had sold my meaningless spreadsheets for $45 million. The funds were safely parked in a secure corporate holding account, waiting for me to allocate them. I had not told Jason yet because I felt the foundation of our marriage fracturing for a very long time. I wanted to secure the legal framework of the massive payout before bringing that kind of generational wealth into our increasingly toxic dynamic. I wanted to protect myself. Now, staring at his pathetic attempt to drown me in $200,000 of fraudulent home equity debt, I realized my caution was the best financial decision of my entire life. I picked up my phone and scrolled past the standard family lawyer we used to draft our basic household wills. I scrolled down to a contact saved simply as David Corporate. David was not just a lawyer, he was a shark. He was a high-powered corporate attorney based out of Manhattan who orchestrated the entire Lumina acquisition and specialized specifically in complex asset protection. I checked the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 1:15 in the morning. I pressed dial anyway. David answered on the second ring, his voice surprisingly alert and sharp. "Claire, to what do I owe the pleasure at this hour?" "David," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady while staring at the $45 million on my screen. "My husband just served me with divorce papers. He has drained our joint savings accounts illegally, locked me out of the house, and maxed out a home equity line of credit to buy a luxury SUV for his pregnant mistress." There was a brief silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly as David instantly shifted into work mode. "Are you safe right now?" "I am in my car," I replied. "I had the local police let me in to retrieve my servers, and then I left. He is not here." "Good. Do not touch anything else of his. Do not engage in any communication if he returns," David commanded with absolute authority. I assume he still does not know anything about Lumina or the acquisition. He firmly believes I am a broke freelancer who will have to beg him for grocery money tomorrow, I replied, a dark smirk finally forming on my face. "Perfect," David said, and I could practically hear the predatory smile in his voice over the phone. "He is going to try to bury you in marital debt to force a quick and highly unfavorable settlement. We are going to let him dig that hole as deep as he possibly can. Pack whatever you need for the next few weeks and get out of the state tonight. Tomorrow morning, we start locking the net." "I want him to lose everything, David. I want him, his mother, and his sister to face the absolute maximum consequences," Claire, David replied smoothly. "By the time we are done, he will not even be able to afford the gas for his mistress's new car." After hanging up, I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I drove straight toward the interstate, heading south toward New York City. The driving rain began to clear as I crossed the state line, replaced by the bright artificial glow of highway lights. By 3 in the morning, I checked into a discreet, high-end, short-term corporate rental in Manhattan. The suite overlooked the city skyline, paid for by a microscopic fraction of the Lumina holding account. To the outside world, and more importantly to Jason, I was couch surfing with sympathetic friends. I unpacked my servers and immediately set up my new command center on the glass dining table. My phone began to buzz repeatedly around 7 in the morning. The first message was from Patricia. I hope you are enjoying the reality check this morning. You should call Jason and beg for a modest stipend before he cuts you off completely. Next came a notification from Stephanie. She had just posted a passive-aggressive video on social media about cutting toxic poor mindset people out of her life, prominently flaunting a brand new designer handbag my home equity undoubtedly paid for. The sheer audacity was staggering. Then a message from Jason arrived. The police called me. Very dramatic, Claire. You can come get the rest of your junk from the garage this weekend. Have your lawyer call Richard. We are offering a walk-away deal to save you from bankruptcy. I did not reply to a single message. I placed my phone face down on the desk and poured myself a cup of black coffee. David arrived at my rental suite exactly at 9 o'clock, flanked by 2 junior partners carrying thick leather briefcases. We spent the entire morning reviewing Jason's financial maneuvers. David's team of forensic accountants worked meticulously mapping out every single dollar Jason had illegally transferred out of the marital estate. We needed absolute perfection before we stepped into the mediation room. Jason wanted a war over pennies totally blind to the millions hovering right above his head. He thought he was playing chess, but he did not even realize I owned the entire board. The first mediation session took place exactly 3 weeks later, inside the sterile glass-walled conference room of a neutral arbitration firm in downtown Hartford. I sat quietly next to David watching the gray city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. David looked immaculate in a dark charcoal suit, reviewing our meticulously organized files with the calm detachment of a man holding an unbeatable hand of cards. The heavy oak door swung open and Jason strode into the room. He looked incredibly smug, wearing a tailored navy suit and a brand new luxury watch that glinted obnoxiously under the bright fluorescent lights. It was clearly another purchase funded by my stolen home equity. Walking right behind him was his attorney Richard, a man who built his entire career on bullying intimidated spouses into submission. Jason did not bother to look at me as he took his seat across the polished mahogany table. He played the role of the untouchable corporate executive perfectly. He adjusted his silk tie, leaned back in his leather chair, and let out a heavy sigh, acting as if my very presence was an exhausting inconvenience to his busy schedule. "Let us make this quick." Richard began slapping a thick manila folder onto the table without offering any professional pleasantries. My client is prepared to offer a very clean and straightforward dissolution of this marriage. We are proposing 0 alimony and 0 spousal support for your client. You keep your personal effects, which I understand you have already abandoned in the garage, and my client retains exclusive ownership of the primary residence. David steepled his fingers together, looking at Richard with an expression of mild, polite amusement. And the marital assets, the joint savings account. As the sole breadwinner of the household, my client utilized those specific funds to manage marital debts and obligations prior to the filing, Richard stated smoothly, not missing a single beat. Furthermore, my client has recently taken significant financial losses in the market. He is currently carrying a $200,000 home equity line of credit, which was utilized entirely to sustain the household during your client's prolonged periods of underemployment. I felt my blood pressure spike instantly, but I kept my facial expression completely blank. He was actually trying to frame the money he stole for his mistress and his sister as a heavy burden he bravely took on because I was not earning enough money. It was a masterclass in financial gaslighting. Given these massive debts, Richard continued pressing his perceived advantage. We believe it is more than generous that we are only asking your client to assume 50% of the home equity liability. We are offering a walk-away deal. Sign the papers today, waive any claims to the house, accept your half of the debt, and my client will not pursue you for spousal support to cover his recent market losses. A true gentleman. David murmured, his voice dripping with a heavy sarcasm that Richard completely failed to grasp. Jason finally looked directly at me, leaning forward with a deeply patronizing smile. "Take the deal, Claire. You have absolutely no money to fight this in court. You can barely afford to support yourself right now. I am taking a massive hit on the house debt because I want a clean break from me and Brittany. Do not make this ugly. You know you cannot afford a lengthy legal battle. I looked at him truly, looking at the man I had spent nearly a decade of my life with. The sheer lack of conscience was staggering to witness. You want me to walk away from the house I put the entire down payment on, I said softly, playing my assigned role of the defeated wife. And you want me to take on $100,000 of debt while waiving all rights to any support, even though we have been married for 7 years. You have not contributed to this marriage financially in years, Claire. Jason snapped his calm facade, cracking slightly to reveal his underlying rage. I am not going to let you bleed me dry now that I am trying to start a real family. I need to protect my assets. David placed a reassuring hand over mine, silencing me before I could respond. He turned his attention back to Richard. Before we discuss waiving any claims or absorbing any liabilities, we need to address the exact timeline of the marital estate. Your client filed for a standard dissolution, but considering the recent financial maneuvers, the legal timeline of separation is absolutely critical. Richard smiled, a predatory gleam flashing in his eyes. This was exactly the topic they wanted us to address. Ah, yes, the date of separation. My client is absolutely insistent on this specific point to protect his recent organizational restructuring at his firm. Jason wanted to establish a hard cutoff line. I knew exactly why. He recently received a substantial corporate bonus, and he obviously wanted to ensure that Brittany's new luxury car and the cash he gifted his sister were legally firewalled from the divorce proceedings. In our jurisdiction, assets and debts acquired after the official date of separation are considered separate property. Jason believed he was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver. My client Richard announced, grandly adjusting his posture to look authoritative, requests that the formal date of separation be legally established and backdated to exactly 6 months prior to the date of filing. David paused, slowly adjusting his glasses. He looked at Richard, then at Jason, performing a masterful display of professional hesitation. 6 months prior to filing. That is an unusually long retroactive period. My client would be surrendering any claim to income, corporate bonuses, or assets your client acquired over the last half year. Those are our non-negotiable terms, Jason stated forcefully, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked intensely satisfied with himself. He thought he was brilliantly cutting me off from his bonus and isolating the money he funneled to his pregnant mistress. Our marriage was functionally over 6 months ago, Claire. You know it, and I know it. Backdate the separation, waive your claims, accept the debt split, and I will not come after you for spousal support. It is the only way you get out of this room without owing me everything you will ever earn. I stared down at my lap, forcing my shoulders to slump forward. I acted exactly like a defeated, exhausted woman who had completely run out of options. The performance was crucial. I needed him to feel an overwhelming sense of victory. I needed him to believe his aggressive intimidation tactics were working flawlessly. 6 months, I whispered, making my voice sound entirely hollow and broken. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood of the conference table. David looked at me. He played his role with the precision of a seasoned stage actor. Claire, if we sign a formal stipulation agreeing to backdate the date of separation by exactly 6 months, anything you earned, acquired, or sold after that specific date becomes entirely your own separate property. But the exact same legal principle applies to him. You cannot claim his recent corporate bonuses. You cannot touch any assets he secured during the last half year. Are you absolutely certain you want to concede this point? I just want it all to be over, I said softly. Jason let out a short and victorious bark of laughter. He leaned back in his leather chair and crossed his arms with immense satisfaction. Finally, she uses her brain. Listen to your lawyer, Claire. You take your clothes, you sign the separation date, and I walk out of here without asking you to pay for my recent investments. It is a win for everyone. Richard eagerly pulled out a prepared legal stipulation, wanting to lock the timeline into place. He slid the crisp white document across the table, bindingly establishing the date of separation as exactly 6 months prior to the divorce filing. David reviewed the document with agonizing slowness. He tapped his expensive silver pen against the margin. He sighed heavily, creating the perfect illusion of defeat. Then he slowly slid the paper toward me. I picked up the pen. Letting my hand tremble, I signed my name on the dotted line. David countersigned as my legal counsel. Richard snatched the document back, signing it with a massive flourish, followed quickly by Jason adding his jagged signature. The trap was officially set. Richard packed the signed stipulations safely into his briefcase. He smiled at Jason, silently congratulating himself on a swift and incredibly cheap victory. They both thought they had just secured a flawless legal firewall around Jason's hidden money and the luxury purchases he made for his pregnant mistress. David leaned back in his chair. He slowly adjusted his cuffs, his posture shifting completely. The calculated hesitation vanished. The faux reluctance evaporated into thin air. "Well," Richard, David said. His tone suddenly shifted from defeated to absolutely glacial. "Since we have firmly and irrevocably established the legal date of separation as exactly 6 months ago, I assume we are fully ready to proceed to formal financial discovery. We will require a full forensic accounting of your client's massive home equity withdrawal." Richard waved a dismissive hand, looking deeply annoyed by the sudden change in atmosphere. "We already offered to absorb the home equity debt if she waives her claim to the house. The financial discovery process is entirely unnecessary. My client is taking the loss." "Oh, it is very necessary." David smiled. It was a terrifying expression that finally made Jason's confident smirk falter. "Because my client will not be waiving her claim to the marital home. We will be taking this entire matter to trial." Jason slammed his hands flat on the mahogany table. The loud smack echoed in the glass room. "What are you talking about? You just signed the separation date. You have absolutely no money to fight me in court, Claire. You cannot afford an attorney like him for a prolonged legal battle." I looked up. I met Jason's furious gaze head-on. The act was officially over. My posture straightened, the carefully crafted illusion of defeat evaporating instantly. I looked him dead in the eye, keeping my voice incredibly steady and cold. "I will see you in court, Jason. Make sure your mother and sister sit in the front row." Richard scowled and pointed a finger at David. "You are playing a dangerous game. If you drag this out, my client will demand 50% of every single dollar your client possesses. We will bury her in legal fees." David stood up calmly. "Opposing counsel is entirely correct that assets acquired during the marriage are subject to equitable distribution. However, opposing counsel seems to have forgotten a very specific stipulation that he himself drafted, the one he insisted my client signed 2 minutes ago." Richard froze completely. The smug excitement drained from his face as David pulled a single thin document from his own file. "My client has been building a limited liability company called Lumina Data Solutions for the past 5 years, David announced, his voice ringing clearly through the tense room. "As you both know, businesses built during the marriage hold marital value. However, the acquisition of Lumina Data Solutions by a Silicon Valley conglomerate was finalized exactly 3 months ago." Jason stared at us blindly. He still did not grasp the magnitude of what David was saying. He still believed I was just coding simple spreadsheets for minor clients. "What acquisition? What are you talking about?" "The buyout funds were fully dispersed exactly 3 months ago," David repeated, leaning forward and locking eyes with Jason. 3 months after the legally established and mutually agreed upon date of separation. "Therefore," David concluded softly, "under the laws of this state, the entire proceeds of that corporate acquisition belong solely to my client as her separate property. The petitioner explicitly, legally, and voluntarily waived his right to any assets acquired during that exact period. He did this in his own arrogant attempt to hide his recent corporate bonuses and the cash he funneled to his mistress." I watched Jason's face carefully. I watched the exact moment his brain tried to process the information. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His face turned pale. "What proceeds?" Richard demanded, pure panic setting in. "How much money? What did she sell?" David picked up his briefcase. "She sold her software company for $45 million. And thanks to your brilliant legal strategy today, your client has absolutely no claim to a single penny of it all." The silence in the conference room shattered as Jason lunged across the polished mahogany table. He knocked over his water glass, sending a puddle of ice and liquid spilling over the crisp legal documents he had just signed. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You set me up!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "You manipulative liar! You knew about this money and you tricked me." David did not even flinch. He calmly stepped in front of me, shielding my body from Jason's aggressive advance. The neutral mediator immediately stood up from the head of the table, warning Jason that security would be called if he did not sit down and compose himself. Jason ignored the warning, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are not walking away with $45 million, Jason shouted. "I am your husband. I supported you for 7 years. Half of that company belongs to me. I will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. I will bankrupt you in legal fees before you ever see a single cent of that buyout." Richard, his attorney, was frantically wiping the spilled water off his briefcase. He looked completely shell-shocked. "Your Honor, I mean," Sir Richard stammered to the mediator, "we formally withdraw our signature from the stipulation." Opposing counsel clearly engaged in the deliberate concealment of massive marital assets. This document was signed under fraudulent pretenses. We demand immediate revocation. David smiled a terrifying razor-sharp smile. "You demand absolutely nothing, Richard?" David replied, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "My client concealed nothing. You explicitly waived the right to formal financial discovery because your client was desperate to hide his own recent corporate bonus. You aggressively pushed to backdate the separation timeline to protect the money your client used to buy a luxury vehicle for his pregnant mistress. You drafted the document. You presented the document. You insisted we sign it today. The stipulation is legally binding and already notarized." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but David cut him off instantly. "If you attempt to invalidate this agreement, we will simply file a motion for sanctions against you and your client for fraudulent conveyance of marital assets. We will present the bank records proving your client illegally drained $84,000 from a joint account. We will show the court exactly how he pulled $200,000 in home equity to pay off his sister's credit cards. Do you really want to present that narrative to a family court judge, Richard?" Richard physically recoiled. He looked at Jason with sheer disgust. "You did not tell me about the home equity line of credit," Jason Richard hissed through clenched teeth. "You told me the joint savings were used for legitimate household expenses. You lied to me." "I did not lie." Jason stammered, the realization of his complete destruction finally taking hold. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. "I just needed to protect my money from her. She was not bringing anything into the marriage. I had to secure my own future." "You just secured your own bankruptcy, Jason," I said calmly. I picked up my briefcase and adjusted my coat. I looked down at the man who had treated me like garbage for years. The man who thought he could discard me and leave me homeless while he started a new life with his intern. "You wanted a clean break. You wanted to make sure I could never touch your hard-earned money. Congratulations, Jason. You got exactly what you asked for." I turned and walked out of the conference room. David followed closely behind me. We left Jason standing in a puddle of spilled water, hyperventilating as his furious attorney began packing up his files and threatening to drop him as a client entirely. The elevator ride down to the lobby was perfectly silent. When the doors opened, we stepped out into the bustling atrium of the legal building. The bright afternoon sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 7 years completely lift from my shoulders. "That was a masterpiece, David," I said, looking at my attorney. "We are not done yet, Claire," David replied as we walked toward the exit. "Securing the $45 million was only phase 1. Jason is a desperate man now. He is cornered deeply in debt and facing a massive drop in his standard of living. He will not go down quietly. He is going to try to drag this into a prolonged court battle to bleed you dry. He will try to claim that the software you built relied on marital resources." "Let him try," I said firmly. I used a private server. I registered the limited liability company entirely under my own name. I funded the initial hosting fees using my own separate credit cards. He never contributed a single dollar or a single minute of his time to my business. I know that, and you know that, David stated as we stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. But family court judges can be unpredictable when massive sums of money are involved. We need an insurance policy. We need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jason was actively engaging in financial fraud against the marital estate. If we present undeniable evidence that he maliciously stole from you to fund his family and his mistress, no judge in this state will entertain his claims on your separate business. How do we get that evidence? I asked. I already have the bank statements showing the transfers. Bank statements only show that the money moved. David explained, hailing a passing taxi. Jason will simply claim those were legitimate gifts or debt repayments approved during the marriage. We need internal communications. We need proof that his mother and his sister knew the money was stolen. We need evidence that they actively conspired to hide marital assets and force you into poverty. If we can prove collusion, we can freeze Patricia and Stephanie's bank accounts. We can make them legally liable for returning every single stolen dollar. I slid into the back seat of the taxi, my mind racing with possibilities. Patricia and Stephanie were incredibly arrogant, but they were not careful. They loved to brag. They loved to leave digital footprints of their luxury purchases. But gaining access to their private communications seemed impossible. They had already blocked me on every platform. I need someone on the inside, I realized aloud. Someone who has access to their accounts. Someone who can see exactly how they are spending the stolen money. David nodded, giving the driver the address to our Manhattan office. Exactly. You mentioned that Stephanie's husband works in architectural design. You said he travels frequently and makes good money. Does he know how his wife funds her lavish lifestyle while he is away working? I thought about Jamal. Jamal was a deeply principled, hardworking African-American man who had overcome significant obstacles to build a highly respected career. He came from a solid blue-collar family and built his architectural firm from the ground up. He had always treated me with genuine respect, completely unlike the rest of his toxic in-laws. He often looked incredibly uncomfortable whenever Patricia or Stephanie made their condescending remarks at the dinner table. Stephanie treated his income like her personal piggy bank, but Jamal strictly managed their primary household finances. No, I said slowly, piecing the puzzle together. Jamal believes Stephanie earns her own money through brand sponsorships on social media. She tells him she is an independent influencer. He has absolutely no idea that Jason handed her $45,000 of my stolen home equity. David smiled, a sharp, calculating smile. Then I suggest you make a phone call, Claire, because a man who manages architectural infrastructure will definitely notice a massive unexplained cash injection into his household accounts. And a man with strong principles will not take kindly to discovering his wife is participating in a coordinated financial crime. I pulled my phone from my purse and scrolled through my contacts. David's strategy was brilliant. We were not just going to defend my fortune. We were going to dismantle their entire toxic network from the inside out. I found Jamal's number and pressed the call button, ready to light the match. The phone rang 3 times before Jamal answered. The connection clicked, bringing the low hum of a busy construction site through the receiver. Claire, Jamal said, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. Is everything all right? I heard about the dinner from Stephanie. She said you and Jason had a massive falling out. I kept my tone perfectly level. Jamal, I need to see you in person. It is incredibly urgent and it cannot wait. Please do not tell Stephanie or Patricia that we are speaking. There was a heavy pause on the line. The background noise faded as Jamal walked into a quieter space. What is going on, Claire? He asked cautiously. You know how my wife gets about me talking to anyone on Jason's bad side right now. I do not want to get dragged into a messy divorce battle. You are already dragged into it, Jamal, I replied softly. You just do not know it yet. I promise I would not call you if this did not directly impact your household finances. I just need 20 minutes of your time. Name a place where Patricia and Stephanie will not show up. Jamal was a highly intelligent man. He handled massive architectural projects and managed multi-million-dollar budgets. He could sense when a situation was dangerously real. Meet me at the Independent Coffee Roaster on the west side of Hartford, he finally agreed. I can be there in an hour. David and I took a sleek black car straight back to Connecticut, leaving my brilliant attorney at a nearby roadside diner while I walked into the independent coffee shop alone. Jamal was already sitting at an isolated corner table, nursing a steaming cup of black coffee. He wore a neon high-visibility vest over his crisp dress shirt, pale dirt dusting his rolled-up sleeves. He looked utterly exhausted. Dark, heavy circles rimmed his deep brown eyes, and his usual confident, upright posture had completely vanished. I sat down across from him. He just looked at me with an expression of profound weariness. "Tell me what is going on, Claire." I took a deep breath. "Jamal, I know you manage the primary household bills while Stephanie handles her personal accounts. Have you reviewed your joint savings or filed your tax returns for this quarter yet?" His dark eyes narrowed instantly. The exhaustion on his face morphed into sudden alertness. My accountant requested verification on a massive deposit that hit our joint account 2 months ago, Jamal said, leaning forward. Stephanie told me she landed a huge brand sponsorship deal with a luxury cosmetics company. I actually bought her a diamond necklace to celebrate her finally building a real business. "Why are you asking me about my taxes, Claire?" "Because she did not get a brand deal," I stated clearly, watching the realization hit him. 2 weeks ago, Jason pulled $200,000 in equity out of the house I put the down payment on. He wired $45,000 directly into your joint account. He used my stolen equity to pay off your wife's credit card debts. Jamal stared at me. The color drained from his face. He looked physically ill. $45,000, he whispered. I knew her social media career was not generating that kind of revenue. I asked her to show me the contracts last week, and she completely blew up at me, accusing me of financial abuse. I reached into my leather briefcase and slowly pulled out the printed bank transfer confirmation. I deliberately slid the crisp white paper across the scratched wooden table. Jamal picked it up, reading the transaction details and the memo line that explicitly read, "Debt consolidation and gift." His hands shook slightly as he set the paper back down. He took a ragged breath. She lied to my face. She looked me right in the eyes and lied while taking stolen money from a woman who treated her with respect. "It goes deeper than just hiding money, Jamal," I said, leaning closer. "Jason is planning to go into family court and claim he is completely broke. He is trying to force me to pay back 50% of that home equity loan. Stephanie and Patricia orchestrated this entire plan with him. They wanted to leave me homeless and drowning in debt to fund their luxury lifestyles." Jamal sat in absolute silence. The man I knew was deeply principled, having built his career through sheer grit and unwavering honesty. To discover his own wife was an active participant in a coordinated financial crime was destroying him in real time. "I need undeniable proof that they colluded," I told him gently. "I need internal communications. Jason will try to claim the transfer was a legitimate family gift. I need proof that Stephanie and Patricia conspired to hide marital assets." Jamal looked out the rain-streaked window. His jaw clenched tightly. He reached into his leather messenger bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and placed it on the table between us. "I did not just ask Stephanie for the contracts," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, furious octave. "When she started acting defensive, I went through her phone while she was sleeping. I found a hidden group chat. It is just Jason, Patricia, and Stephanie. I printed everything out for my divorce lawyer. I am leaving her, Claire. I refuse to be married to a parasite who would participate in destroying another person just to buy designer bags." I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of printed text logs. The timestamps aligned perfectly with our anniversary dinner. The cruelty of their words was staggering. Jason wrote, "Serving her tonight. The equity loan cleared. Money is moving now." Patricia responded, "Finally, make sure you get the house. We cannot let that trash walk away with our investment." Stephanie added, "Did you wire my share? My credit cards are maxed out from the Paris trip. Jamal is getting suspicious." Jason replied, "Handled. Just play your part tonight. Break her down so she signs the walk away." "They planned it like a cartel," Jamal whispered, looking completely disgusted. "Patricia knew everything. She actually encouraged Jason to buy a new luxury car for his pregnant mistress, using your equity so you could not touch the cash. Use these papers, Claire. Burn them all to the ground. I carefully closed the manila folder and placed it securely into my briefcase. I looked at Jamal, a genuine, terrifying smile crossing my face. Thank you, Jamal. You have absolutely no idea how spectacular this fire is going to be. With Jamal's undeniable evidence safely in my possession, David's legal trap was not just set, it was fortified with impenetrable steel. Jason and his greedy family thought they had successfully manipulated the legal system. They thought they had buried me alive. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that I now held the match, the gasoline, and the exact coordinates of their entire fragile house of cards. The courtroom showdown was rapidly approaching, and I was finally ready to end this war. The morning of the trial arrived with a cloudless sky that felt at odds with the destruction I was about to unleash inside the Connecticut family court building. I walked up the concrete steps alongside David. He carried his leather briefcase with the relaxed stride of a predator who knew the exact outcome of the hunt. My heart did not race. My palms did not sweat. After weeks of enduring the agonizingly slow turning of legal gears, I felt nothing but an icy, crystalline focus. We approached the wooden doors of courtroom 4B. The corridor outside was usually a place of hushed anxiety for divorcing couples, but Jason had apparently decided to treat our dissolution like a victorious corporate merger. He stood near the water fountain, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He leaned against the marble wall, projecting the arrogant aura of a man who believed he held every winning card. Surrounding him was the toxic royal court he had assembled for my execution. Patricia stood to his right wearing a dramatic wide-brimmed hat and a matching designer blazer. She clutched a luxury handbag like a weapon. Stephanie stood next to her mother, aggressively reapplying lip gloss while complaining to Jason about how early she had been forced to wake up. Jamal was noticeably absent. He had officially filed for divorce last week, locking Stephanie out of his primary accounts. Yet here she was maintaining her rich influencer facade, fully expecting Jason to win big today so she could continue leeching off him. And then there was Brittany. She stood slightly behind Jason, her hand resting performatively on her growing belly. She wore a tight maternity dress designed specifically to highlight her pregnancy, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph as David and I walked down the corridor. "Look who finally decided to show up!" Patricia announced, her voice deliberately loud enough to echo off the marble walls. I suppose she had to take the city bus. It is hard to afford an Uber when you do not have a real job. Stephanie snickered, snapping her compact mirror shut. "Do not be mean, Mom. It is hard to get out of bed when you just code silly little spreadsheets all day." She is probably exhausted from doing absolutely nothing. I did not break my stride. I did not even glance in their direction. I walked past them in total silence, David perfectly matching my pace. The sheer lack of emotional reaction from me seemed to irritate Jason far more than a screaming match would have. He craved the drama. He needed me to look broken and defeated to validate his cruel choices. "Enjoy the show," Claire, Jason called out from behind me. "I hope you brought a good pen. You are going to be signing a massive amount of debt over to yourself today. Try not to cry." We pushed through the heavy doors and entered the courtroom. The air conditioning was running high, making the space feel sterile. David and I took our designated seats at the respondent table. Jason and his entourage swaggered into the room a few moments later. Patricia and Stephanie claimed prime seats in the front row of the gallery, whispering loudly over the rustle of our legal files. Brittany sat directly behind Jason, occasionally leaning over the wooden partition to whisper in his ear and giggle like a high school teenager. "They are treating this legal proceeding like a reality television reunion," David murmured to me, neatly organizing his documents on the table. "They genuinely have no idea what is about to hit them." "Let them perform," I whispered back, my eyes fixed firmly on the empty bench at the front of the room. The higher they climb their pedestal of arrogance, the harder they will crash into the concrete. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock. She was a stern, highly respected woman in her late 50s, known throughout the district for possessing zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics or unprepared attorneys. Everyone stood as she took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the thick file resting before her. "All right," Judge Harrison said, her sharp voice cutting through the remaining whispers in the gallery. "We are here today regarding the dissolution of marriage between Jason and Claire. I see we have some highly contested financial issues regarding the division of marital assets and marital debts." Richard Jason's aggressively slick attorney stood up instantly and buttoned his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. We are here to establish an equitable division of this estate. As previously outlined in our filings, my client has been the sole financial provider for this household for the last 7 years. The respondent, Claire, has been sporadically engaged in low-yield freelance work, contributing virtually nothing of substance to the marital estate." In the gallery behind us, Patricia let out an audible, highly exaggerated sigh of satisfaction. Judge Harrison immediately shot a dark, warning look toward the gallery before turning her attention back to the defense table. "Continue, counsel." Due to the respondent's lack of financial contribution, my client was forced to take on substantial debt simply to maintain the basic marital lifestyle, Richard proclaimed loudly, gesturing expansively toward Jason. Jason nodded along with practiced solemnity. "Specifically, my client was forced to open a home equity line of credit in the amount of $200,000. We are formally asking the court to assign 50% of this massive debt to the respondent and grant my client exclusive ownership of the primary residence, as he is the only party capable of servicing the mortgage. Furthermore, Your Honor," Richard added, leaning forward to twist the legal knife, "because the respondent is currently unemployed and possesses no significant assets of her own, we are asking the court to completely deny any request for spousal support. My client should not be financially penalized for moving on with his life and preparing to support his new growing family." Richard gestured dramatically toward Brittany, who offered the judge a demure, innocent smile while stroking her pregnant belly. The sheer audacity of the argument was almost poetic in its evilness. They were openly, shamelessly using the mistress and the illegitimate child as a human shield against financial responsibility. They wanted the judge to pity the cheating husband, while legally burying the betrayed wife under a mountain of his fraudulently acquired debt. Judge Harrison frowned deeply, making a quick note in her ledger. The courtroom fell dead silent as she finished writing. She placed her pen down, folded her hands, and turned her piercing gaze directly toward our table. She looked at David. Counsel Judge Harrison asked, her tone flat and commanding, "Does your client have a formal response to these extensive financial claims?" "We do have a response, Your Honor." David began, his voice smooth and perfectly measured. He buttoned his suit jacket and stepped out from behind our table. "However, before I address the division of marital assets and liabilities, I must address the supplementary filings opposing counsel pushed across my desk just 10 minutes before this hearing began." Richard jumped up immediately, practically vibrating with aggressive energy. "Your Honor, I submitted those character affidavits because they provide crucial context regarding the financial demands my client is making today. The respondent is going to claim she is a victim of sudden abandonment. We have provided sworn testimony proving that my client was the actual victim of prolonged financial and emotional abuse." Judge Harrison peered over her reading glasses, her expression tightening. "Proceed, Mr. Vance, but keep it relevant to the financial dissolution." Richard eagerly opened his folder. "We have submitted sworn affidavits from Patricia and Stephanie, the mother and sister of the petitioner. These affidavits detail a horrific pattern of behavior by the respondent over the last 7 years. According to these sworn statements, Claire consistently refused to seek gainful corporate employment, using a fake freelance coding business as a shield for her profound laziness. She isolated my client from his family, created a hostile living environment, and drained his resources with her erratic behavior." In the gallery behind us, Patricia sat up straighter, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat with an air of absolute superiority. Stephanie nodded along solemnly, wiping away a completely fake tear from her cheek. Jason put on the performance of a lifetime. He lowered his head, rubbing the bridge of his nose, as if the mere mention of his traumatic marriage was too much to bear. Brittany wrapped her arm around his shoulder, playing the role of the devoted savior. Because of this documented emotional abuse and calculated financial negligence, Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly. My client is fully justified in demanding that the respondent assume 50% of the home equity debt. Furthermore, we are formally requesting that the respondent be ordered to pay 100% of my client's legal fees. She should not be allowed to walk away scot-free after treating her husband like a personal ATM. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not glare at them. I let them build their tower of lies as high as they possibly could. They had spent weeks coordinating this elaborate smear campaign, convinced that the judge would gladly strip me of my remaining dignity and saddle me with their fraudulent debt. Judge Harrison turned her gaze back to our table. Her eyes were sharp and assessing. That is quite a severe characterization, counsel. How does your client respond to these sworn affidavits? David smiled. It was a brief, chilling expression. Your Honor, David said, stepping out into the center aisle. It is truly fascinating to hear opposing counsel read these character affidavits aloud in a court of law. It is especially fascinating considering that these sworn statements completely and undeniably contradict the digital paper trail left by the affiants themselves. Richard scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. My clients provided sworn testimony under penalty of perjury. You cannot simply dismiss them. I am not dismissing them, Richard, David replied, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. I am actively proving them to be perjured documents. Your Honor, we have submitted Exhibit B to the court clerk this morning. It contains certified time-stamped communication logs retrieved directly from a private group chat involving the petitioner, his mother Patricia, and his sister Stephanie. Jason's head snapped up. The performance of the exhausted victim vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panic. In the gallery, Stephanie let out a sharp gasp. She knew exactly what David was holding. These communication logs were provided to us quite voluntarily by Stephanie's husband, Jamal, David announced clearly. Jamal recently discovered his wife's involvement in a coordinated financial crime against my client. He filed for divorce last week, and he graciously provided us with the exact blueprints of this smear campaign. Richard looked at Jason, his eyes wide with confusion. Jason had clearly lied to his own attorney about the existence of these messages. If I may quote from the group chat, dated the exact evening my client was served with divorce papers, David said, pulling a crisp sheet of paper from his file. Jason wrote, serving her tonight. The equity loan cleared. Money is moving now. Patricia responded, finally. Make sure you get the house. We cannot let that trash walk away with our investment. Judge Harrison's jaw tightened. She flipped to Exhibit B in her heavy binder, her eyes scanning the highlighted text messages. David continued reading, his voice amplifying in the silent room. Stephanie added, Did you wire my share? My credit cards are maxed out from the Paris trip. Jamal is getting suspicious. And Jason replied, Handled. Just play your part tonight. Break her down so she signs the walk away. The air in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy. Patricia looked like she was about to pass out, her face draining of all color. Stephanie shrank down into her wooden bench, trying to make herself as small as physically possible. Your Honor, David said, turning back to the judge. The petitioner and his family did not just submit false affidavits today. They engaged in a highly coordinated, premeditated conspiracy to emotionally destroy my client, unlawfully drain her marital assets, and commit perjury to cover their tracks. They orchestrated a vicious smear campaign to justify stealing my client's home equity to fund luxury purchases. We ask that the affidavits be struck from the record and that the affiants be investigated for perjury. Richard stammered frantically, flipping through his own files. Your Honor, I had absolutely no knowledge of these communications. I believe you counsel, Judge Harrison said, her voice dripping with ice as she glared fiercely at Jason. But your client certainly did. Mr. Vance, you have brought a circus into my courtroom. You have submitted sworn documents that are directly contradicted by your own written communications. You plan to financially ruin your wife while claiming she was the abuser. Jason opened his mouth, his face flushed dark red with humiliation and fear. Your Honor, those texts are taken completely out of context. She was draining my accounts. I had to protect my money. You mean the money you stole from the joint savings account? David interjected smoothly. Or do you mean the $200,000 you fraudulently pulled from the home equity line of credit? Because we are about to discuss exactly where that money went. Judge Harrison slammed her gavel down, stopping Jason before he could shout another excuse. We will address the fraudulent conveyance of assets immediately, Judge Harrison ordered. But first, since the petitioner is claiming extreme financial hardship, I want to see the comprehensive financial disclosures from both parties right now. Hand them to the bailiff. We are going to see exactly who is hiding what in this marriage. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the table. The smear campaign was officially dead. The perjury trap had snapped shut. Now the judge was asking for the financial disclosures, and the $45 million bomb was about to detonate right in the middle of Jason's shattered reality. The bailiff stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He approached the petitioner's table first. Richard handed over a thin manila folder with a look of extreme confidence. Richard adjusted his tie and offered the judge a practiced smile of weary compliance. Your Honor, my client's financial disclosure is completely transparent, Richard announced, projecting his voice so the gallery could hear every word. You will clearly see the devastating financial burden he has been forced to carry. The massive debt ratio speaks for itself. He is a hard-working finance professional drowning in liabilities incurred by a spouse who simply refused to contribute. In the front row, Patricia leaned forward, a satisfied smirk curling her lips. She whispered something to Stephanie, who giggled behind her hand. Brittany patted her stomach, looking at Jason with wide, adoring eyes, as if he were a martyr being crucified for his generosity. The bailiff took the folder and brought it to the bench. Then he turned and walked toward our table. David did not hand over a thin folder. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a thick, heavily sealed envelope bearing the embossed logo of a major international banking institution. He handed it to the bailiff with absolute reverence. Respondent's full financial disclosure, Your Honor, David stated calmly. Certified by federal auditors and fully authenticated just this morning. Richard scoffed loud enough for the court reporter to hear. Federal auditors for a freelance gig, please. She probably listed her laptop and a few cheap desk chairs as business assets. Judge Harrison ignored the interruption. She opened Jason's file first. The courtroom fell into a tense, heavy silence as she scanned the pages. Her expression remained entirely unreadable, but her eyes narrowed as she flipped through the highlighted sections. Mr. Vance! Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. You list your annual base salary, but you have conveniently omitted the exact figure of your recent corporate bonus. You also list the $200,000 home equity line of credit as a shared marital liability alongside the $84,000 you completely drained from your joint savings account just hours before serving your wife with divorce papers. Jason stood up, placing his hands flat on the table, trying to project the authority he used in his corporate boardrooms. Your Honor, as my attorney stated, that debt was entirely necessary. I had to consolidate our household liabilities because Claire brought absolutely zero income into the marriage. I was bleeding cash just to keep the lights on. Judge Harrison held up the printed text message logs that David had submitted earlier. Do not insult my intelligence, Mr. Vance. We have already established through your own written communications that you funneled $45,000 of that home equity loan to your sister to pay off her luxury shopping debts. We have established that you wired $65,000 to a dealership to purchase a vehicle for your affair partner. Are you genuinely standing in my courtroom today, under oath, asking me to force your wife to pay for your mistress's car? Richard jumped in desperately. Your Honor, my client took those actions to secure his own financial independence after years of being dragged down. The core issue remains his lack of liquid assets. He simply does not have the funds to support the respondent or pay her legal fees. We are asking for a clean break so he can rebuild his ruined finances. Judge Harrison glared at Richard for a long, agonizing moment. Then she set Jason's fraudulent financial disclosure aside. She picked up the thick sealed envelope David had submitted. She broke the heavy wax seal, the sharp tearing sound echoing loudly in the quiet room. She pulled out a stack of crisp watermarked documents. Jason crossed his arms over his chest, his posture radiating arrogance. He looked at me and mouthed the words, "You are getting nothing." He genuinely believed the judge was about to read a bank statement showing a balance of a few $100s. He expected the judge to look at me with pity and tell me I had to find a real job to pay off the massive debt he had assigned to me. Judge Harrison turned to the first page of my disclosure. Her eyes scanned the top paragraph. She stopped. She frowned slightly, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. She pulled the document closer to her face, reading the lines again. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. She flipped to the second page, which contained the official certification from the holding bank and the legal summary of the software acquisition. Her eyes widened a fraction of an inch. For a judge who had presided over complex family court cases for 20 years, she was visibly stunned. Very slowly, Judge Harrison took off her reading glasses. She set them down on the wooden bench with a soft click. She looked directly at David. Counsel Judge Harrison said, her voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "Are these federal banking certifications accurate?" David stood up, completely unbothered by the heavy atmosphere. "They are entirely accurate, Your Honor. They were verified by the acquiring conglomerate's legal team and our own forensic accountants just yesterday." Judge Harrison looked from David to me. Her expression shifted from professional skepticism to profound understanding. She saw the entire picture. She saw the trap Jason had built for himself, and she saw the absolute crushing magnitude of the wealth I had been quietly shielding. Jason, misinterpreting the judge's shock, let out a harsh, victorious laugh. "See, Your Honor, I told you, she is completely broke. She has absolutely nothing to her name. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone. Just assign her half the debt and let me walk away from this disaster." Judge Harrison turned her gaze toward Jason. The look she gave him was a mixture of absolute pity and sheer disgust. It was the look you give a man who just gleefully leaped out of an airplane without checking if he was wearing a parachute. "Mr. Vance," Judge Harrison said, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity, "your counsel stated earlier today that the respondent, your wife, is currently unemployed and possesses no significant assets. He stated that she has contributed nothing of substance to this marriage." "That is correct, Your Honor," Richard answered proudly, stepping forward. "She is entirely dependent." Judge Harrison picked up the certified bank statement, her fingers gripping the edges of the paper. "Then I suggest you and your client sit down and listen very carefully to what I am about to read into the official court record." Judge Harrison cleared her throat, her eyes darting between the document in her hand and the arrogant man standing before her. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice echoing in the dead-silent courtroom. "The certified financial disclosure submitted by your wife, the woman you just claimed possesses no significant assets, shows a confirmed liquid balance in her corporate holding account." Jason crossed his arms, letting out a heavy sigh of feigned exhaustion. "Yes, Your Honor," he said dismissively. "I am sure her little freelance coding account has a few $100s. I told you she does not bring any real money into this household." "The balance," Judge Harrison continued, raising her voice to cut right through his patronizing interruption, "is exactly $45,250,000.00. The courtroom completely froze. The air conditioning unit hummed loudly overhead, the only sound in a space that had suddenly been drained of all oxygen. Jason did not move. His arms remained crossed over his chest, but his face went completely blank. His brain visibly short-circuited, unable to process the astronomical number the judge had just spoken. He blinked once. He blinked twice. "Excuse me?" Jason stammered, a nervous, breathless chuckle escaping his lips. "I think you misspoke, Your Honor. Did you say 45,000? I said, $45 million, Mr. Vance," Judge Harrison snapped, slapping the bank certification flat onto her wooden bench. held in a corporate account under Lumina Data Solutions LLC, a software company entirely founded and owned by the respondent Claire. The funds are the direct result of a corporate acquisition by a major Silicon Valley conglomerate finalized recently. The physical transformation of Jason was spectacular to witness. The smug, untouchable finance director evaporated in a fraction of a second. His arms dropped heavily to his sides. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grip the edge of the mahogany defense table just to remain standing. His skin turned a sickening shade of gray, the arrogant flush completely draining from his cheeks. He stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, his jaw working soundlessly. Next to him, Richard looked like he had just been struck by lightning. The aggressive divorce attorney snatched his own copy of our disclosure packet, which David had just placed on his side of the table. Richard frantically flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the federal tax stamps and the corporate buyout agreements. His hands began to shake violently. He dropped the file onto the table, breathing heavily as he stared at the staggering string of zeros printed on the banking certification. In the gallery behind them, the Royal Court of Toxic Enablers experienced a collective breakdown. Patricia let out a loud, high-pitched gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if she were suffering a sudden cardiac event. She grabbed the wooden railing separating the gallery from the court floor, her knuckles turning stark white. 45 million, Patricia whispered loudly, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a state of absolute shock. My daughter-in-law has $45 million. Stephanie sat completely paralyzed next to her mother. Her designer sunglasses slipped from her perfectly styled hair and clattered loudly onto the wooden floor. The sister who had just mocked me for being a broke, lazy freelancer was now staring at a woman who could buy and sell her entire lifestyle 100 times over without making a dent in her bank account. Stephanie looked at her own hands, realizing the sheer magnitude of the wealth she had just completely alienated herself from. Brittany, sitting directly behind Jason, looked wildly confused. She tugged aggressively on the back of Jason's suit jacket. "Jason, what is she talking about?" Brittany hissed loudly, completely ignoring courtroom decorum. "Jason, tell them she is lying. We are supposed to get the house. We need that money for the baby." Jason violently swatted Brittany's hand away, completely ignoring his pregnant mistress. He was staring directly at me. His chest heaved up and down as he struggled to draw breath into his lungs. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down onto his shoulders. While he was busy treating me like an uneducated servant, while he was sneaking around spending our emergency funds on luxury cars and hotel rooms, I had been building an absolute empire right under his nose. I sat perfectly still, maintaining absolute eye contact with him. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I let the cold, hard silence stretch out between us, allowing him to feel the crushing weight of his monumental stupidity. Suddenly, the terror in Jason's eyes vanished rapidly, replaced by a ravenous, desperate hunger. The greedy finance executive inside him roared back to life. He realized that this money existed within his marriage. He thought he had just won the ultimate lottery. He thought his betrayal, his cruelty, and his infidelity were about to be rewarded with the biggest payout of his entire life. "Your Honor!" Richard shouted, regaining his footing and stepping quickly toward the center aisle. He smoothed his suit jacket, his voice trembling with newfound aggressive excitement. The narrative had completely flipped in his mind. He was no longer trying to force a broke woman into debt. He was now staring at a multi-million-dollar marital asset. "Your Honor, if this is true," Richard declared loudly, "this entirely alters the dissolution proceedings. If the respondent generated this massive asset during the course of the marriage, my client is legally entitled to an equitable distribution of those funds. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state. My client supported her while she built this business. We immediately and formally withdraw our previous settlement offer. My client demands his 50% share of the Lumina acquisition." Jason stood up tall, his chest puffing out with overwhelming arrogance. He pointed a finger directly at me, a sickening smile of absolute triumph spreading across his face. "You hear that, Claire?" Jason yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "That is my money too. I funded your life while you played startup in our guest room. I paid the utility bills while you sat on your computer. You tried to hide this from me, but I am going to take half of everything you own. $22 million belongs to me. Patricia cheered audibly from the gallery. Yes, Jason. She clapped her hands together, her eyes shining with greedy delight. Take half of it. We deserve it, after everything we put up with. Judge Harrison slammed her heavy wooden gavel down against the sounding block with explosive force. The sharp crack rang out like a gunshot, instantly silencing Patricia and Jason. Order in my courtroom! Judge Harrison roared, her face dark with fury. Any further outbursts from the gallery and the bailiff will clear this room immediately. Sit down, Mr. Vance, before I have you restrained. Jason sank back into his leather chair, but his smug, victorious smile remained firmly plastered on his face. He looked at Richard and nodded eagerly. They genuinely thought they had me trapped. They thought they were about to walk out of this courthouse as multimillionaires. David leaned back in his chair. He slowly and deliberately unbuttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with the calm precision of an executioner preparing the final strike. He picked up a single thin document from our table and stood up. It was time to close the jaws of the trap, Your Honor. David said, his voice completely devoid of the hesitation he had faked so brilliantly during our mediation session. Opposing counsel is entirely correct that assets acquired during the course of a marriage are legally subject to equitable distribution. However, opposing counsel seems to have developed sudden amnesia regarding a very specific binding legal stipulation that he himself drafted and insisted my client sign just 3 weeks ago. Richard froze in his tracks. The aggressive, greedy excitement instantly drained from his face. He stared at the thin piece of paper in David's hand. If the court will please review the executed stipulation regarding date of separation. David continued, handing the document to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. The petitioner was absolutely adamant that the legal date of separation be firmly established and backdated to exactly 6 months prior to the date of filing. This was done by his own arrogant admission to protect his end-of-year corporate bonuses and separate his recent financial maneuvers from the marital estate. Judge Harrison took the paper from the bailiff. She reviewed the stipulation, a grim, fully understanding smile touching the corners of her mouth. She looked down at Richard, raising one eyebrow. The massive acquisition of Lumina Data Solutions. David announced, his voice ringing like a bell through the silent courtroom, was finalized, and the funds were completely dispersed exactly 3 months ago. That is exactly 3 months after the legally established and mutually agreed upon date of separation. The trap snapped shut with a metaphorical bang that seemed to echo off the marble walls. Therefore, David concluded softly but firmly, under the strict family laws of this state, the entire $45 million is the sole and separate property of my client. The petitioner explicitly, legally, and voluntarily waived his right to any and all assets acquired during that specific period in his greedy attempt to hide his own money from his wife. I kept my eyes locked on Jason. I watched the exact moment his brain finally processed the catastrophic magnitude of what he had done. His arrogant attempt to cut me out of a paltry corporate bonus, his desperate maneuver to protect the cash he stole for his mistress and his sister, had just cost him $22 million. He had securely locked himself out of the fortune. He had personally handed me the impenetrable shield that protected my entire life's work. No, Jason gasped, gripping his hair with both hands, his eyes wide and wild with genuine horror. No, 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 that is not fair. I did not know about the money. Ignorance of your spouse's professional success is not a valid legal defense to a signed contract, Mr. Vance. Judge Harrison said coldly. You aggressively pushed for this date of separation. You legally signed the stipulation in front of a mediator. Your attorney drafted the paperwork. The court accepts the timeline as binding and absolute. You set me up, Jason screamed, leaping out of his chair and pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You manipulative, lying fraud. You planned this. Bailiff, restrain him, Judge Harrison ordered instantly. 2 armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Jason by the shoulders and forcing him roughly back down into his wooden chair. He was hyperventilating loudly, his chest heaving up and down as he stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Your Honor," Richard stammered, looking physically ill as he backed away from his own client. "We request an immediate continuance. This is unprecedented. We need time to review this development." "Request denied," Judge Harrison snapped, slamming her hand flat on the bench. "We are finishing this today, based on the authenticated financial disclosures and the undeniable evidence of fraudulent conveyance regarding the home equity loan. I am issuing my ruling right now. The respondent Claire retains 100% of the Lumina assets as her sole separate property." In the gallery, Patricia let out a piercing wail, completely burying her face in her manicured hands. Stephanie sat staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the utter destruction of her own life and the revelation of my untouchable wealth. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued glaring down at Jason with absolute disgust. "Because you illegally utilized marital home equity to fund an extramarital affair and pay off third-party debts for your sister, you are hereby ordered to assume 100% liability for the $200,000 loan. You will also fully reimburse the respondent for the $84,000 you unlawfully drained from the joint savings account." "I do not have the money!" Jason cried out, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I gave it away. The car is in her name." He pointed frantically backward at Brittany, turning on his pregnant mistress in an instant. "She has the money! Sell the car!" Brittany scrambled backward on the wooden bench, looking at Jason like he was a monster. "You told me it was a gift," Brittany shrieked, totally forgetting where she was. "You told me you were rich. You promised to buy a house in the Hamptons. Then I highly suggest you sell whatever assets you currently possess," Mr. Vance, Judge Harrison stated firmly, ignoring the outburst from the gallery. "Because you have exactly 30 days to reimburse the respondent, or you will be held in severe contempt of court and face potential jail time. The marital home will be sold immediately, and the proceeds will be divided equitably, but only after the respondent is fully reimbursed from your share. This court is officially adjourned." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down one final time. The sound was definitive. It was over. I had won. The immediate aftermath in the courtroom was a scene of absolute chaotic devastation. Judge Harrison swept gracefully out of the room, leaving behind a profound ringing silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds before the massive explosion occurred. "You ruined us!" Patricia shrieked, scrambling up from the gallery bench. She did not lunge at me. She turned her fury entirely on Jason. The mask of the supportive and loving mother evaporated the second the money officially vanished. "You idiot! You arrogant and stupid boy! $22 million. You threw away $22 million for a lease on a luxury car and a cheap tramp. Excuse me, I am carrying his child. He is going to support me." "Support you with what?" Stephanie screamed, finally breaking out of her paralyzed shock. Her own life was crumbling fast and she was desperate for a scapegoat. "He is hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and Jamal is divorcing me. He froze our bank accounts this morning. I have absolutely nothing left." Jason sat completely frozen at the defense table, his head buried deep in his hands, rocking back and forth as his toxic family tore each other apart right behind him. Richard, his lawyer, was hastily stuffing papers into his briefcase, looking exactly like a man desperate to flee a burning building before his client asked him for legal advice he could no longer afford to pay for. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive physical weight I had carried for 7 long years had finally been lifted off my chest. David packed his briefcase with calm efficiency, a small and highly satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Well," he murmured quietly to me, "I would say that went exactly as planned." "Thank you, David," I said quietly, feeling a genuine smile touch my own face for the first time in months. As we turned to walk down the center aisle of the courtroom, Jason finally looked up from the defense table. His face was blotchy, his eyes bloodshot and wild with a desperation I had never seen before. The arrogant executive who had sneered at me in the French restaurant was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man who had just realized he had mathematically destroyed his own life. "Claire, wait," Jason pleaded, his voice cracking loudly as he stumbled out from behind the heavy oak table. He reached a hand out toward me, though the armed court bailiff immediately stepped forward to block his path. Claire, please. You cannot do this. I will lose everything. The debt is too much. I cannot pay it. The firm will fire me if they find out about the fraud judgment. Please, we were married for 7 years. I loved you. I stopped walking and turned to look at him. I looked past his shaking frame to Patricia, who was suddenly silent. She was watching me with desperate, hungry eyes, silently hoping I would show mercy so she could somehow get a piece of the massive payout. I looked at Stephanie, who was shivering in her seat, her fake influencer facade completely destroyed. I looked at Brittany, who was backing away toward the heavy wooden doors, suddenly realizing she had hitched her wagon to a rapidly sinking ship. You love the control, Jason, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the large courtroom. You loved having someone to belittle just to make yourself feel bigger. You loved having a scapegoat. When you served me those papers, you wanted me out on the street. You wanted me completely ruined. You do not get to ask for mercy just because you were the one who ended up caught in the exact trap you built for me. It was her fault, Jason cried out, pointing a shaking finger directly at Patricia. She pushed me to do it. She hated you from day one. She told me to take the equity money. Patricia gasped loudly, clutching her designer handbag in mock horror. I did no such thing. You are a grown man, Jason. You made your own disgusting choices. Do not drag your mother into your messy divorce. They were turning on each other like starving animals. There was absolutely no loyalty left. There was no family bond. It had only ever been an alliance of convenience built entirely on mutual selfishness and greed. Goodbye, Jason, I said coldly. I will expect the $84,000 transfer by the end of the month. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy mahogany doors and stepping out into the bright sunlit corridor. I did not look back. I did not need to. David walked beside me, pulling his phone from his inside pocket. The civil judgment today is just the beginning, Claire, he explained as we navigated the busy hallway. By officially ruling that the home equity transfer was a fraudulent conveyance, Judge Harrison just handed us the ultimate weapon. We are filing a formal notice with the state banking authority this afternoon. Because Jason wired stolen marital assets to third parties to deliberately hide them from a divorce proceeding, those specific transactions are now legally classified as wire fraud. I looked at David, absorbing the magnitude of the legal machinery he was setting into motion. Will Patricia and Stephanie be held liable for receiving the stolen funds? Absolutely, David replied smoothly. My team is filing strict financial injunctions against both of their personal bank accounts as we speak. Since Patricia knowingly accepted stolen funds and actively encouraged the illegal purchase of Brittany's vehicle, her assets are subject to immediate freezing. Stephanie is in an even worse position. She took $45,000 of your equity money to pay off unsecured credit card debt. We are forcing a mandatory legal clawback. The bank will aggressively reverse the payments, reinstating her massive debt with penalty interest, and seize whatever cash she has left to reimburse you. As we reached the main lobby of the massive courthouse, a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows near the security checkpoint. It was Jamal. He looked utterly exhausted, but the heavy emotional burden that had weighed down his broad shoulders at the coffee shop was visibly lifting. He held a thick manila envelope tightly in his right hand. Jamal, I said, walking over to him, I did not expect to see you here today. I could not sit in that gallery and watch them pretend to be victims, Jamal said, his deep voice steady and resolute. I waited out here to give this directly to your attorney. He handed the envelope to David. These are the finalized bank statements from my personal accounts. I officially separated all my finances from Stephanie at 8 o'clock this morning. I also filed a formal police report regarding the $45,000 wire transfer. I strictly documented it as stolen funds unlawfully deposited into a shared account without my explicit consent. David took the envelope, a look of profound professional respect crossing his sharp features. This is the final nail in the coffin, Jamal. By filing that police report, you have legally immunized yourself from the impending fraud investigation. Stephanie, however, is going to face a very harsh criminal inquiry. She deserves it, Jamal stated firmly. I loved her, but I refuse to be collateral damage in her twisted family schemes. I just received a frantic text message from her saying the judge ruled against Jason. She is demanding I send a private car to pick her up because her credit cards are suddenly declining. I smiled warmly at Jamal. What did you tell her? I told her to take the city bus. Jamal replied, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. We walked out of the courthouse together, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. The dominoes we had carefully aligned were now falling with brutal, unrelenting force. The fraudulent conveyance ruling was an absolute death sentence for Jason's career. As a director of finance, his professional integrity was his only currency. The compliance department at his firm had strict federal protocols regarding any employee involved in civil or criminal fraud. David had already drafted a formal letter to Jason's corporate compliance officer, attaching the public court records. In the financial sector, a judge officially ruling that an executive committed fraudulent conveyance and hid assets is grounds for immediate termination. Jason was not just going to lose his high-paying job. His financial licenses would be permanently suspended. He would be entirely unemployable in his chosen field. He thought he was untouchable, but his arrogance had blinded him to the catastrophic legal consequences of his actions. You look like you are breathing easier, Claire Jamal observed as we reached the curb where a sleek black car was waiting for David and me. I admitted, honestly. For 7 years, they made me feel like I was taking up too much space. They made me feel like I owed them for the privilege of being in their presence. Today I realized they were just parasites feeding off my silence. Jamal nodded in profound understanding. They feed off anyone who lets them. Good luck, Claire. Enjoy the city. As Jamal walked away toward the transit station, I got into the back seat of the car with David. The engine purred quietly as we pulled away from the courthouse. I watched the heavy stone building fade into the distance through the tinted window. The trap had worked flawlessly. The fraudulent conveyance was exposed, the assets were protected, and the toxic family that had tried to destroy me was currently tearing each other apart in the ruins of their own making. But we still had to watch the final pieces of their lives crumble to dust. The drive back to Manhattan was the most peaceful journey I had experienced in 7 years. As I settled into the quiet luxury of the leather seat, David opened his laptop to initiate the next phase of our strategy. The civil court victory was magnificent, but the bureaucratic fallout was going to be an absolute masterpiece. We were about to watch Jason lose everything that defined his pathetic status-obsessed existence. 2 days later, the exact consequences of the fraudulent conveyance ruling slammed into Jason with the force of a freight train. He walked into his prestigious financial firm on Thursday morning, likely expecting to charm his way out of whatever rumors had trickled down from the courthouse. Instead of his corner office, he was intercepted in the main lobby by the head of corporate compliance and 2 armed security guards. David had ensured that certified copies of Judge Harrison's ruling were delivered directly to the firm's legal department. In the highly regulated finance sector, a senior director officially found guilty of hiding assets, executing fraudulent transfers, and attempting to defraud his spouse is a walking liability. They did not just fire him, they aggressively severed all ties. They escorted him to his desk, handed him a cardboard box, and gave him exactly 10 minutes to pack his personal items while security watched his every move. He was stripped of his corporate access badges, his company phone, and his dignity in front of the very colleagues he had spent years trying to impress. Because his termination was labeled as a dismissal for gross ethical misconduct, his severance package was completely voided. Even worse, the firm was legally obligated to report his actions to the regulatory boards. His financial licenses were suspended, pending a massive federal review. Jason was officially blacklisted from the entire industry. The high-powered career he valued more than his marriage was dead. But David and I knew that losing his job was only the opening act of his financial nightmare. The main event was the Internal Revenue Service. Jason always thought he was the smartest man in the room when it came to money. When he arranged the home equity loan and funneled the cash to his sister and his mistress, he deliberately tried to bypass standard gift tax reporting. Furthermore, when he aggressively pushed to backdate our separation to protect his end-of-year corporate bonus, he inadvertently created a massive discrepancy in his recent tax filings. He had tried to classify the home equity withdrawal as shared marital debt while simultaneously attempting to shield his incoming bonuses as separate untaxed property. You cannot play both sides of the fence with the federal government. He had hidden income disguised luxury purchases as legitimate household debt and failed to properly report the $45,000 transfer to his sister as a taxable gift. Once the family court judgment became a matter of public record, it automatically triggered a severe red flag within the federal tax monitoring systems. The IRS loves an easy target, especially when a judge has already explicitly documented the financial fraud in a civil ruling. Exactly 1 week after his public firing, Jason received a formal notice of audit. The IRS does not negotiate politely like family court mediators. They act with ruthless mechanical efficiency. They immediately placed a federal tax lien on all of his remaining personal accounts. The private bank account where he had stashed the stolen $84,000 from our joint savings was frozen completely solid. He could not withdraw a single cent to buy groceries, let alone pay high-priced defense attorneys to save him. I heard through the grapevine that he tried to call his lawyer Richard begging for representation against the federal government. Richard's office promptly declined his calls, citing a massive lack of retainer funds. The panic he must have felt in that moment was entirely of his own making. He was carrying a $200,000 mortgage liability, owing me tens of thousands in court-mandated restitution, facing mounting daily penalties from the IRS, and possessing absolutely zero income. The man who had constantly mocked my freelance work as pathetic was now entirely destitute. I sat in my Manhattan rental suite reviewing the digital updates David forwarded to me. Every new alert painted a clearer picture of his absolute devastation. With his accounts completely frozen by the federal government, Jason missed his very first payment on the home equity line of credit. The bank, seeing that their borrower was suddenly unemployed and under active federal investigation, wasted no time. They issued a formal notice of default. The massive Connecticut house, the physical symbol of his precious upper-class facade, was slipping right through his fingers. He tried desperately to sell the house to cover the mounting debts, but he could not find a buyer willing to pay his heavily inflated asking price in a rushing market. Even if he did manage to sell it, the court order explicitly mandated that I be fully reimbursed from his share of the proceeds first. He was trapped in a financial cage of his own flawless design. He tried reaching out to his former corporate buddies for emergency loans, but his calls went entirely unanswered. The wealthy network he had desperately cultivated completely abandoned him the moment his name became officially associated with fraud and federal audits. He was a complete pariah in his own city. He had nobody left to turn to except the family that had happily helped him dig his own grave. Stripped of his dignity and his bank accounts, Jason was forced to pack whatever clothes he could fit into a single suitcase and abandon the Connecticut house before the bank formally foreclosed and locked the doors. He had no choice but to crawl back to Patricia. The arrogant executive who had sneered at me over a $2,000 dinner was now moving back into his childhood bedroom, bringing an avalanche of federal tax problems straight to his mother's front door. The poetry of his ruin was breathtaking. While Jason was busy suffocating under the weight of his federal audits, his sister Stephanie was experiencing her own spectacular crash into reality. Jamal did not hesitate or waver in his resolve. The morning after our explosive courtroom victory, he officially filed for a highly aggressive divorce. Jamal was a meticulous man who built his architectural firm from the ground up, and he applied that exact same precision to dismantling his marriage to a financial parasite. Because Stephanie had willingly and knowingly accepted $45,000 of my stolen marital equity, Jamal's legal team immediately filed an emergency financial injunction against her. They successfully argued to the judge that Stephanie's active participation in a coordinated financial crime exposed their joint household to severe legal liabilities and potential federal clawbacks. The judge agreed without hesitation. Jamal was granted full and exclusive control over all of their primary marital assets pending the final divorce settlement. Stephanie discovered her new reality while attempting to maintain her fake luxury influencer lifestyle. She walked into an exclusive boutique in downtown Hartford completely oblivious to the legal storm gathering over her head. She gathered armfuls of designer clothes and confidently handed the cashier her platinum credit card. The transaction was instantly declined. She tried a second card, then a third. Every single account was completely frozen solid. The boutique manager, recognizing the signs of a sudden financial cutoff, politely but firmly asked her to leave the store empty-handed. Furious and deeply humiliated, Stephanie stormed back to the house she shared with Jamal, intending to scream at him for daring to touch her spending money. She threw open the front door, ready to launch into a theatrical tantrum. Instead, she found Jamal standing quietly in the foyer. Resting next to his feet were 3 large cardboard boxes containing her expensive clothing and her extensive collection of designer handbags. He had packed her belongings with the exact same cold efficiency she had shown when helping Jason plot my downfall. Jamal did not raise his voice. He simply handed her a thick manila envelope containing the formal divorce petition and the emergency financial injunctions. He looked at the woman he had loved and supported for years with nothing but absolute freezing detachment. "You have 30 minutes to get the rest of your personal items and get out of my house," Jamal stated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. "The locks are being changed this afternoon. Your car lease has been officially transferred entirely to your name, and since the accounts are frozen, I suggest you figure out how to make the next payment yourself." Stephanie completely broke down. The arrogant woman who had sneered at me across the restaurant table collapsed onto the hardwood floor, sobbing and begging Jamal for forgiveness. She tried to blame her mother. She tried to blame Jason. She claimed she was just following her family's advice and had no idea the money was actually stolen. Jamal simply stepped around her weeping form, opened the front door, and pointed toward the driveway. He refused to entertain a single excuse. She had made her choice when she conspired to leave another woman homeless, and now she was experiencing the exact same terrifying reality. With nowhere else to go and absolutely zero access to cash, Stephanie was forced to drag her cardboard boxes out to her car. She drove straight to her mother's house, weeping hysterically as she pulled into Patricia's manicured driveway. But she was about to discover that Patricia was in no position to offer any financial rescue. My attorney David had been incredibly busy executing the next phase of our retaliatory strategy. Because Patricia had knowingly accepted stolen funds and actively encouraged the illegal purchase of a luxury vehicle using my home equity, she was fully implicated in the fraudulent conveyance scheme. David filed aggressive civil claims against her personal estate. To ensure she could not hide or transfer any money before the court ruled on her involvement, the judge authorized a temporary freeze on Patricia's primary banking accounts. Patricia found out about her frozen assets in the most publicly humiliating way imaginable. She had marched into her exclusive country club that afternoon, desperately trying to maintain her wealthy facade despite the swirling rumors about Jason's spectacular courtroom defeat. She sat down with her usual group of high society friends, ordering expensive cocktails and loudly complaining about how the legal system was deeply biased against successful men like her son. When the waiter brought the bill, Patricia confidently handed over her premium bank card. The waiter returned a few minutes later looking incredibly uncomfortable. He informed her in front of the entire table of wealthy socialites that her card had been declined by the issuing bank. Patricia's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson. She frantically pulled out her phone to check her banking application, only to find a glaring red notice that her accounts were under a legal hold pending a civil fraud investigation. But the financial humiliation was only the beginning of her absolute ruin. The women sitting at the table with her did not offer to cover the bill. They did not offer sympathy. In the insular, gossip-driven world of Connecticut high society, the truth about the trial had already spread like an uncontrollable wildfire. These women had read the public court transcripts. They knew exactly what Patricia had done. They knew she had actively conspired to steal from her own daughter-in-law to fund an illicit affair. One by one, the wealthy women stood up from the table, grabbed their designer purses, and walked away without saying a single word to her. They completely cut her off. She was officially a social pariah, permanently exiled from the only community she valued. When Stephanie arrived at Patricia's house sobbing about Jamal kicking her out, she found her mother sitting in the dark living room, clutching a declined credit card and staring blankly at the wall. Patricia had lost her social standing, her pristine reputation, and her access to her wealth all in a single afternoon. By the end of the week, the beautiful suburban house Patricia prized so highly had become a toxic, suffocating prison. Jason moved into his childhood bedroom, dragging his massive federal tax liabilities and his absolute unemployment with him. Stephanie occupied the guest room, complaining bitterly about her frozen accounts and mourning her dead influencer career. Patricia paced the hallways, furious and disgraced. They were all trapped together under one roof, completely broke, deeply bitter, and constantly turning on each other. The very people who had conspired to destroy my life were now tearing each other apart in the miserable, suffocating ruins of their own making. The dominoes had finally finished falling, and the silence they left behind was utterly beautiful. It had been exactly 4 weeks since the courtroom verdict shattered their illusion of invincibility. I was leaving the sleek glass lobby of my new Manhattan corporate office late on a Friday evening. The sky had suddenly opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour that soaked the busy city streets. I stood under the deep architectural awning, protected from the harsh weather, waiting for my private driver to pull the car around to the front entrance. I was wrapped in a tailored cashmere coat, my mind focused entirely on the philanthropic foundation I was formally launching the next morning. Then I heard a hoarse, desperate voice call my name over the loud, rhythmic sound of the driving rain. I turned slowly to see 2 figures emerging from the dark shadows of the adjacent parking garage. It took my brain a fraction of a second to register exactly who they were. Jason and Patricia. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The pristine custom-tailored suits and expensive designer blazers were completely gone. Jason wore a rumpled, ill-fitting raincoat, his face gaunt, unshaven, and sickly pale. Patricia looked even worse. Her perfectly coiffed hair was plastered flat against her skull by the heavy rain, her expensive leather shoes entirely ruined by the massive muddy puddles forming on the concrete sidewalk. They had clearly been waiting outside my office building for hours, completely desperate, having tracked down my new corporate address through public business filings. "Claire, please wait," Jason shouted, rushing forward before my building security detail could intercept him. He stopped just short of the dry awning, shivering violently in the freezing rain. "We need to talk to you right now. Please just give us 5 minutes of your time." I stared at him with absolute unwavering indifference. The arrogant executive who had mocked my career and stolen my emergency savings was now standing in a dirty puddle, desperately begging for a fraction of my attention. "What could we possibly have to discuss, Jason?" I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the loud noise of the storm. The family court order was explicitly clear. You were instructed not to contact me under any circumstances outside of formal legal counsel. "We do not have legal counsel anymore," Patricia cried out, stepping forward to join her ruined son in the pouring rain. Her voice cracked sharply, lacking all the haughty country club arrogance she had weaponized against me for 7 long years. "They dropped us, Claire. We cannot afford the astronomical retainer fees. The banks officially took the house this morning. The foreclosure went through. We are being evicted today." Patricia actually fell to her knees on the wet concrete. The great judgmental matriarch of Connecticut high society was kneeling in a dirty Manhattan puddle, sobbing uncontrollably while the rain lashed against her face. "Please, Claire, we are a family. You cannot just leave us out here to drown like this. We made terrible mistakes, but we are still family." "Family," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like a completely foreign concept. "Family does not change the front door locks in the middle of a thunderstorm. Family does not steal emergency savings to buy luxury vehicles for pregnant mistresses." You completely lost the right to use that word the night you sat at that restaurant and smiled while your son tried to throw me out on the street. Jason stepped closer, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and frantic. It was Brittany, he pleaded completely, throwing his pregnant mistress under the bus without a single second of hesitation. She manipulated me, Claire. She seduced me and made me think I needed to protect my assets from you. I was confused. I was stressed from the heavy workload at the firm. I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you. Give me another chance. I can be a better husband. We can fix this and start over. The sheer cowardice of his excuse was breathtaking to witness. He was a grown man, a former senior finance director, and he was standing in the rain aggressively blaming a 26-year-old intern for his own calculated financial fraud. You did not look confused when you drained my bank account, Jason, I replied smoothly, crossing my arms. You looked incredibly proud of yourself. You planned a highly coordinated ambush to break my spirit. You thought you could strip me of my dignity and force me to absorb your massive debts. You only want me back now because you saw the certified bank document with $45 million printed on it. You do not love me. You love my net worth. My driver pulled the sleek black car up to the curb, the bright headlights cutting through the dark sheets of rain. The driver stepped out and quickly opened the rear door for me, keeping a wary, protective eye on the two soaked, desperate figures blocking the public sidewalk. Patricia reached a shaking, wet hand out toward my cashmere coat. Claire, I am begging you on my knees. Just a small loan. Just enough money to help us secure a basic rental apartment. Stephanie has absolutely nothing left. Jamal froze everything. We have nowhere to go tonight. The federal government took everything else. I looked down at Patricia, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. I remembered exactly how she had laughed when Jason told me to pay the $2,000 restaurant bill. I remembered reading her text message, telling Jason to make sure the trash walked away with nothing. You told your son that I brought absolutely nothing to the table, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You said I had no place in your exclusive world. Well, Patricia, this is my table now, and neither of you have a seat. I turned away from them, stepping into the warm, dry interior of my car, and closed the heavy door with a solid thud. Through the tinted rain-streaked glass, I watched Jason finally collapse, falling to his knees right next to his weeping mother. They were both sobbing on the wet pavement, completely broken, entirely destitute, and utterly alone in the massive city. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the glowing city traffic, leaving them behind in the dark storm they had created for themselves. The absolute finality of that rainy night in Manhattan marked the end of my direct involvement with Jason, but the consequences of his actions continued to unravel his life with spectacular precision. I learned the details of his ultimate isolation a few weeks later through the inevitable grapevine of mutual acquaintances who were eager to share his dramatic downfall. Jason had returned to Connecticut completely soaked, entirely defeated, and facing the harsh reality of an impending eviction. He dragged himself back to the luxury apartment he had leased for Brittany, desperately hoping to find some semblance of comfort or support from the woman he had destroyed his marriage to impress. Instead, he opened the door to an apartment that had been completely stripped bare. Brittany was young and incredibly opportunistic, but she was certainly not stupid. The moment she witnessed the catastrophic courtroom verdict and realized Jason was saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal debt, her romantic connection to him vanished instantly. She had signed up for a wealthy finance director who promised her a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. She had absolutely zero interest in playing nursemaid to an unemployed, disgraced fraudster, actively under federal tax investigation. According to the building concierge, Brittany had wasted no time. While Jason and Patricia were busy begging me for mercy in the pouring rain, Brittany had hired a moving crew. She packed all her designer clothes, her expensive jewelry, and every single luxury item Jason had purchased for her during their affair. She loaded everything into the pristine white Range Rover. Because Jason had arrogantly put the vehicle title entirely under her name to hide the asset during our divorce, he had absolutely no legal recourse to stop her. She legally owned the car my home equity had paid for, and she drove it right out of his life without a backward glance. She left him a single, hastily scribbled note on the bare kitchen counter. She explicitly stated she was moving back to her parents in Ohio and promised to send him formal child support paperwork the moment the baby was born. She did not leave a forwarding address. She did not offer a single word of sympathy for his ruined career or his frozen bank accounts. She simply discarded him the exact same way he had tried to discard me. Jason was left standing completely alone in an empty, echoing apartment he could no longer afford to rent. His high-paying career was dead. His industry reputation was permanently shattered. His mother and sister were drowning in their own massive financial crises, completely unable to offer him shelter or assistance. His pregnant mistress had abandoned him, taking the last of his stolen assets with her. The wealthy social circles he had spent years desperately trying to infiltrate had turned their backs on him entirely. He had foolishly sacrificed his entire life for a hollow illusion of absolute power, and now he was left completely isolated from everyone. While Jason was busy navigating the total destruction of his own making, I was standing on the expansive wrap-around terrace of my new Manhattan penthouse. I watched the early morning sunrise paint the towering city skyline in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The crisp morning air felt incredibly clean. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the absolute, unshakable silence of a home that belonged entirely to me. There were no more arrogant comments about my career choices, no condescending glares from a toxic mother-in-law, and absolutely no hidden financial liabilities threatening to crush my future. There was only profound peace, hard-earned and fiercely protected. Later that exact same morning, I walked into the grand sunlit conference room of my newly established corporate headquarters. I had taken a dedicated, substantial portion of the Lumina acquisition funds and officially launched a nonprofit foundation. Our core mission was highly specific. We specialized in providing high-powered legal representation and emergency financial resources for women actively escaping financial abuse in their marriages. I personally hired a dedicated team of ruthless attorneys, top-tier financial advisors, and expert forensic accountants to ensure that no woman who walked through our doors would ever have to face a brutal courtroom ambush alone. Check Kilai.